This wasn't a tool made to execute someone. It was designed for something much worse. Imagine a device that makes it impossible to sleep, painful to speak, and sends jolts of agony through you with every tiny twitch. That's the brutal reality of the Heretic's Fork. It wasn't meant to kill you, it was meant to make you beg for death. Its purpose wasn't to leave a messy wound, but to completely shatter your will. What kind of society comes up with something so ingeniously cruel? Why would anyone invent a tool whose only real function is to trap a person in a state of constant, conscious agony? The answer is buried in a time of intense belief, suffocating fear, and the absolute power of an institution that believed ideas were the most dangerous poison of all. To understand the Heretic's Fork, you have to understand the world that created it. We're talking about the late Middle Ages, a time dominated by the massive and terrifying power of religious authorities. This wasn't just about faith, it was about total social and political control. The Catholic Church wasn't just a religious body, it was the pillar of European society. Its rules were tied into law, science, and the very idea of reality. In that world, heresy, believing anything that went against official church doctrine, wasn't just a sin, it was rebellion, a spiritual sickness that people believed could tear civilization apart. The fear of heresy was real and everywhere. It was seen as a disease that could infect towns, topple kingdoms, and doom generations to hell. In response, the Church created the Inquisition, a powerful and feared office with one chilling mission: find and punish heresy wherever it hid. Inquisitors would arrive in a town with great ceremony, offering a grace period for heretics to confess. If you came forward, you might get off with a pilgrimage or a public whipping. But if you were accused and refused to confess, things got much darker. While the fork is popularly associated with the Spanish Inquisition, which began in 1478, its exact origins are debated, and direct evidence of its widespread use by them is scarce. Many stories about it come from later accounts and museum displays of sometimes questionable origin. Abuse of power was common in this era. An accusation, maybe from a neighbor with a grudge, could get you arrested. You had no right to face your accuser, no right to a lawyer. Once you were in the system, you were basically presumed guilty. The only question was how and when you'd confess. This is where torture became a system. To the medieval mind, pain was a tool for purification. It was believed physical torment could force the truth out of someone. A confession was the ultimate prize. It proved the Inquisition's power and created a public show of repentance. While some historians argue that torture was used less than popular myth suggests, its application was still horrific. And it was in this climate of fear, control, and the sanctioned use of pain that one of history's most psychologically brutal devices was imagined: the Heretic's Fork. It was a tool built not just for pain, but for absolute mental and spiritual defeat. At first glance, the Heretic's Fork looks deceptively simple. It's not a complex machine like the rack, and it doesn't have the instant horror of the breaking wheel. Its evil is in its focused, elegant cruelty. The device is a single piece of metal with two forks, one at each end. Each fork has two sharp, needle-like prongs. It was built to be wedged between a person's chin and chest. Picture it. The accused, already terrified and weak from prison, is brought into a stark room. Their hands are bound. The torturer takes the fork. One set of prongs is pressed into the soft flesh under the chin, while the other is pushed against the upper chest. Then a leather strap is buckled tightly around the neck, locking the device in place. The first feeling is immense, constant pressure. The bottom prongs dig into the skin above the breastbone, a sharp, endless ache. The top prongs push into the jaw, forcing the head into a rigid, upright position. The victim has to stare straight ahead, or even tilt their head back, like they're looking up at the heavens in some twisted mockery of prayer. The posture is unnatural and quickly becomes excruciating. But the real horror starts with movement. Any movement. If the victim's head nods forward from exhaustion, the top prongs pierce deeper into their throat. If they try to crane their neck back for relief, the bottom prongs dig into their chest. Every breath is a risk. A deep sigh hurts. A cough or a sneeze brings a fresh wave of agony as the prongs tear at their flesh. The fork wasn't designed to hit vital organs, at least not right away. Its design was more sinister. It was made to create a state of constant, inescapable pain that was entirely controlled by the victim's own body. The torturers could just attach the fork and leave. The device itself was the jailer. The pain wasn't a single event. It was a continuous state of being, a prison made of metal and their own skin. They couldn't look down. They couldn't rest their head. They were trapped with the threat of piercing steel hanging on every breath, every twitch, every heartbeat. The physical pain of the heretic's fork was just the start. Its real goal was psychological, to systematically break down a person's mind and spirit. This wasn't for a quick confession. It was a tool for slow, grinding defeat, turning the body's own needs into weapons of torture. First, and perhaps most cruelly, it made speaking incredibly painful. The fork was a tool of silence. Often used on people accused of spreading heresy, the device made forming words an agonizing act. Any movement of the jaw would cause the prongs to dig into the flesh under the chin. The victim couldn't protest. They couldn't scream for mercy. They couldn't whisper a prayer without hurting themselves. They were trapped in a silent world of pain, their voice stolen. It was deeply symbolic. The heretic, accused of speaking dangerous words, was now rendered mute. Then came the assault on the most basic human need: sleep. The heretic's fork was an instrument of sleep deprivation. Rest was impossible. The second a victim's exhausted muscles relaxed and their head started to droop, the prongs would bite into their throat, jolting them awake with a spike of pain. Hours bled into days. Their body would scream for rest, but the fork would refuse. This kind of prolonged sleep deprivation would inevitably lead to a psychological breakdown, causing disorientation, paranoia, and hallucinations. When reality itself starts to crumble, a confession to anything can start to look like a welcome escape. Even eating or drinking became an ordeal. Swallowing requires throat muscles to contract, an act the fork turned into a punishment. Victims likely suffered from dehydration and hunger, further weakening their bodies and minds. This combination of constant pain, enforced silence, and sleep deprivation created a perfect storm of psychological torment. The victim was completely isolated. Their world shrank to the cold metal at their throat and the unending pain it delivered. Popular lore says that the fork was sometimes engraved with the Latin word abjuro, meaning "I recant." While there's little primary evidence for this, it speaks to the device's legend as a constant, mocking reminder of its ultimate goal: not to find truth, but to manufacture a confession and break the human spirit. We're exploring one of the most psychologically brutal devices ever imagined. The story of the heretic's fork is a powerful reminder of how far people will go to enforce their beliefs. If you find this deep dive into the darker side of history compelling and think it's important to understand these stories so we don't repeat them, please take a second to subscribe and hit that like button. It really helps us continue to make detailed explorations like this one. Now, let's get back to the grim final outcomes for those subjected to this torment. For anyone trapped in the heretic's fork, the ordeal could only end in a few ways, and none were pleasant. The device was designed to prolong suffering, but death was often the inevitable, if unintended, conclusion. One of the most likely paths to the end would have been slow and agonizing. The small puncture wounds from the prongs, constantly irritated, would have been highly vulnerable to infection. In an age without antibiotics, even a small wound could be a death sentence. As days passed, the areas under the chin and on the chest could become festering sores, adding a new layer of burning pain. Sepsis could set in, leading to fever, delirium, and a slow, painful death as the body rotted from the inside out. Starvation and dehydration were also constant threats. Since swallowing was so painful, a victim would avoid eating and drinking. Over time, their body would simply waste away, growing weaker until their systems finally shut down. And then there was the desperate way out. A person pushed beyond all human limits could choose to end it by forcefully throwing their head forward or backward. This would drive the prongs deep into their flesh. But even this final desperate act might not bring a quick death. Some accounts suggest the prongs were specifically sized so they wouldn't hit a major artery right away, leading to a slow, torturous death from blood loss. It was the ultimate cruelty. Even in choosing to die, the victim was denied a swift escape. Of course, the intended outcome was a confession, a broken, weeping admission of guilt. Once the Inquisitors had it, the fork might be removed. The victim would then be handed over for the final public spectacle, the auto da fe, or act of faith. This was a ceremony where sentences were read out. For those who confessed, their mercy might be getting strangled before being burned at the stake. For those who stayed defiant, they were often burned alive. The confession, pulled from them by the silent, agonizing pressure of the fork, was the final piece of theater needed to justify the public execution that was always the grim finale. The heretic's fork wasn't just a torture tool, it was the prelude to the pyre. The heretic's fork, just a simple piece of metal and leather, casts a long, dark shadow over history. While historians debate how widely it was actually used, its power as a symbol is undeniable. It's become an emblem of cruelty and a chilling example of human ingenuity twisted to inflict suffering in the name of ideology. It represents a time when power was so absolute it could approve the systematic dismantling of a human being, all while claiming to save their soul. The fork reveals a disturbing truth about torture. The most effective methods aren't always the most violent, but the most psychologically invasive. It wasn't made to mangle a body, but to hijack it, turning natural things like speech, movement, and sleep into sources of unbearable pain. It's a stark reminder that fear has long been used as a tool of control, meant to force obedience and crush dissent. Today, artifacts believed to be heretics' forks are in museums, grim relics of a brutal past. Their memory serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and zealotry. In a strange twist, the device has found a modern reinterpretation in BDM subcultures. There, with the crucial elements of safety and enthusiastic consent, it's used to explore themes of control and trust. This transformation from a tool of oppression to one of exploration only highlights the horror of its original purpose, which had no consent, no safety, and no humanity. Ultimately, the story of the heretic's fork forces us to think about compassion, tolerance, and justice. It makes us confront the darkness that can hide behind piety and social order. By looking at this horrifying chapter of our past, we find a powerful reason to protect human rights, freedom of thought, and the dignity of every single person, principles for which those who once wore this terrible device suffered and died.